I want to welcome you to our college planning class, How to Pay for College Without Going Broke. I want to give you a little bit of background on me. My name is Crystal Tate, and I graduated from Western with a degree in finance. And I put myself through school, so I really do understand the challenges involved in this process. I didn't get a lot of help from my parents. And I really do wish I had known back then how to go about picking the best school academically so that I could get out in 4 years, and then also how to plan for it financially. Because I know a lot of people will really just talk about one or the other, and we really believe that you have to marry the two in order to make the most out of this process. And that's why I really love doing what I do, because I get to help families so that they don't have to struggle like I did. What we believe is that you should have a strategic plan so that when you're picking schools, they're a good fit academically, socially, and financially for the families. Now, after I graduated from Western, I was actually working with a small financial planning company out of Linwood, and I was doing their retirement plans and data entry and tracking client business. And it wasn't nearly as much fun as it might sound. So, after a few years there, actually, the people that I was working with shared with me the opportunity of working as a college financial planner. And I am extremely grateful to them for having shared with me the resources to make this business happen. I am working with a great team who has been doing college financial planning now for over 20 years. So I'm excited to share with you some of the great information that they have made available to everyone. Now, I also would like to mention that we do have live classes as well. So if you want to check out those dates and share that information with friends or family, you can find that on my website at collegefinancingcoach.com/classes. Or if you sign up for our newsletter, we do send out monthly the classes that we will have upcoming, as well as we post those to Facebook. Now, what we're going to cover today is this public versus private school conversation, as I know a lot of people will think, well, private school, it's just not really an option. And that's not true. Two of the main things that I tend to hear from families are one, private school is just too expensive, so it's just not going to happen. Or two, that the students sometimes don't feel smart enough to attend a private school. And we really want to make sure that you see how it can be a possibility if that's something that you want to look at. Now, student positioning and financial positioning, these are the two big components of this entire process. So student positioning, we're going to talk about how we academically position our students, and financial positioning, how do we understand what the colleges are looking at when it comes to our finances. So we're going to dive deeper into both of those so you understand how they work separately, but like I said before, more importantly, how they work together in this process. And then we will go through some case studies so you can see what this is like for families, and then have some closing thoughts. First, though, I always like to have a look at how expensive college is. And whenever we talk about the cost of attendance of a university, this is an all-in cost. So this is tuition, room and board, books. Sometimes they'll throw in personal expenses and transportation expenses. So on average here, for a public university, and this is just average across the nation, it's about $22,000 a year. And this can vary dramatically though. As we know, UW is at about $25,000 a year. But if we start looking at schools down in California, like UCLA, that's where we could be looking at sticker prices of $55,000 a year for an out-of-state public school. Now, when it comes to an average private university, yet again, still they're $43,000 a year, but this is average across the nation. We do know, obviously, that there are some of the high-end elite universities as well, where some of those are $60,000, $70,000 a year. So this is part of what we want to look at is, well, what is that sticker price of the universities, and how can we really bring that cost down? Because we know that we keep seeing that prices are trending up, and obviously the point is that we want to make sure that college is affordable. Now, this whole private versus public school conversation, one of the first things that we always tell people that they need to focus on is what is the goal of the university? So, if we take UW as an example, UW is a great school, and uh, but if you wind up going and say you're in Chem 101, you're going to walk in, the professor's going to be like, you know what, you guys are all qualified, you got here. But at the end of the day, 1/3 of you just aren't going to make it through my class. That's what we call the weeding out process. There's just not enough slots for all of the kids, and so they're going to get cut as they go through. So a lot of the big research universities, that happens. And so sometimes it's thinking about, well, is that going to be a good fit for me? Because if we think about maybe a small to mid-sized private school, really the whole goal and reason the majority of those institutions exist is to educate their undergraduate students. So that's really positioning to really help a student succeed versus weeding them out. And so if that's the case too, we tend to have smaller class sizes. The professor tends to be the one that's teaching the class, and so there's a little bit more accountability to be had. And a lot of times, kind of where this can come into play is, well, for a student, say if you're a straight A student, you could probably do well no matter where you go. But maybe you're an average or below average kid, and if you walk into that 300-person classroom, that could be a huge deterrent for you and getting out of that school in 4 years and setting yourself up for success. And so that's part of, okay, well, if we want to have more of that small to mid-sized classroom, and having that professor know us, we can get that a lot of times at some of those small to mid-sized private schools that we might not always get at the big universities. And really what it comes down to is graduation rates, because this is the big dirty secret of the entire university system, is that we wind up spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to go to these schools, and we don't necessarily wind up getting out, or getting out period, or getting out in 4 years. And so to give you an example of what's going on in Washington State right now, Eastern, 46% of their kids will graduate in 6 years. Okay, it's not great. If we think about that, that's 5 out of 10 kids aren't going to get out of that school in 6 years. Now, Whitman, however, 80% of their kids will get out in 4. So really what I want to know at the end of the day is, how much is this going to cost me? So if we look at Eastern, their cost is about $21,000 a year. We go for 6 years, so we spend $126,000, and we don't have a graduation. Versus Whitman, on average, people spend about $25,000 a year. I know that's not their sticker price, and we're going to talk about that. But on average, it's about $25,000 a year for only 4 years. So then we only spend $100,000, and we got out in 4. Okay. One of the biggest things that I tell people is that you're better off thinking about what's going to be a good fit school, rather than just focusing on the sticker price of the institution and making a decision that way. Because Whitman looked more expensive from the start, but it wound up being cheaper at the end. So that's why we want a good fit academic, social, and financially to really round it out. Now, our intentions are to get a private education at a public education price. Sometimes you can bring it down more. And even if you're looking at public school, like I went to Western, still great choices, we still want to get it at the lowest possible cost. So knowing what we have available to us to do that. Now, this first piece called student positioning, what this is where we take all of the picture of our students, so their academics, their GPA, their test scores, all of the fun extracurriculars and stuff that make them up, and then we take that and we match it with the best list of schools for them. And of course, we want to make sure we're maximizing getting financial aid while we do so. So one of the first things we look at is academic side of a student. So that's going to be SAT or ACT score. Now, to talk about that a little bit more, the colleges truly do not care which test you take, whether it's SAT or ACT. The colleges just care how well you score. So it's to your benefit to figure out which test you're stronger at and focus just on that one. So a lot of times what I have my kids do is what we call a diagnostic test. So this is an SAT versus ACT test. It's 3.5 hours. So then you don't have to take both tests multiple times. You can take this and figure out which test you're stronger at. And the point being that if you're an SAT kid, then you can say, okay, this is the content and information that I need to know. I can get scheduled for that one test and study my heart out towards it, rather than having to split your focus and take both tests multiple times. You just don't benefit from that. And so when it comes to the diagnostic test, we usually recommend the earliest would be at the end of sophomore year, because that's when you've kind of covered especially the math content on what's going to be on the ACT. So at the end of sophomore year, over the summer into junior year, as early into junior year as possible, we'd like to get started on figuring out which test we're strong at. So you have really all of junior year to be able to get scheduled for and take these tests without having to feel like the stress of time constraints and all of that getting closer to applications for the colleges. Now, when it comes to the differences on these tests, it isn't as major as it used to be. The biggest thing tends to be that the tests are structured differently. So some kids do have a preference on one or the other, and the SAT is considered a little bit more tricksy, so they sometimes aren't really clear in how they're asking their questions. The ACT tends to be a little bit more straightforward. ACT, however, is a faster paced test, so if we do have an issue with timing, sometimes kids will get caught up on that. So nowadays the SAT is out of a 1600 score, so that's going to be math and the critical reading, and the ACT is out of a 36, and that's a composite of all 4 sections that are on the ACT. A sweet spot that we say to kind of start aiming for on the test is SATs about 12 to 1400. That's where a lot of schools start opening up and giving us more opportunities to get money to go. As well on ACT, it's about a 27 to a 32. So that's just kind of a first guideline of what to look at. Now, for both of these tests now, writing is optional. However, I'm going to tell you it's not actually optional. The colleges do want you to take the writing section, so anytime you schedule, please make sure that you schedule the writing piece as well. Now, the one thing on here that a lot of people are always wondering is SAT subject tests. Like, what are those, and do I even need to worry about it? And the answer is it really depends on the university. So an SAT subject test is just that. It is a subject that you are getting tested on, and it's actually done through the SAT people. The irony is that if you're taking an AP exam, so say you're taking AP US history, and you're like, I'm really strong in that, and you need to take a SAT subject test, it's actually, AP exam is the same as the SAT subject test in terms of content and information, because it's made by the same company. And so if you have to take a subject test, your benefit to take it around the same time, you have to take your AP exam because you've already studied and prepped for it. But not all universities require these. It tends to be more higher elitist schools. Sometimes if you want to go into a specific major like engineering, they want you to take math or chemistry, physics, something like that, to be able to prove that you have the knowledge. So that's the intention of it. So a lot of times kids will wind up taking them in May or June of junior year, or in the fall of senior year, if they wind up discovering that any of the schools do want those. Now, I always have on here, is studying for these important? And really the answer is always yes, because just like with anything, the more time you put into it and understanding how the test works, as well as learning the content and information, the more comfortable you will be, and the better you can improve your score. So I really don't care how you study, I just care that you do. So if you get a book and that's your thing, that's great. I really like online programs just because it tends to allow kids to work at their own pace, but have some guidance and structure that goes along with it. But if you're like, I'm not going to do studying unless I'm going to be sitting with a tutor or in a class, then that's the way that it is. Really, Usually we say you want to get at least 20 to 30 hours in terms of study and prep. Okay. One of the things that I like to use as an example, because this tends to come up a lot, is as we get into junior year, kids are really excited about the idea of getting their first job. And so a lot of times they think, well, that's how I can help out. You know, I can get a job and help contribute that way. And then mom and dad on the other side, they're like, okay, well, you need to start applying for all of these scholarships, because these scholarships is where we're going to start getting some money. Okay, so you need to do that. And I'm the on the other side saying, you know what, those are both really great, but you're not going to get as much benefit. You might get a couple $1,000s out of a job. You might get a couple $1,000s out of some of those scholarships. But if you study for your SAT or ACT, you can get $10,000 or $20,000 or more from these universities. So it is definitely, you're going to get more bang for your buck in putting your time in studying for whichever test you're stronger at, and focusing on that first to position yourself well at the colleges. Now, this article, I like to talk about this because a lot of you guys have probably heard of Claremont McKenna. It's a school down in California, and a college administrator resigned because they got caught faking SAT scores. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but if you think about kind of like, well, why would they do something like that? And the answer is, well, if the college is going to benefit from having higher SAT scores in the marketplace. So what happens is, if we say, hey, I have higher test scores than in US News and World Report and Princeton Review and all of those places, they look more prestigious. And when the school looks good in the marketplace, that makes alumni happy, and then happy alumni donate. So it tends to be this vicious cycle where it comes down to money a lot of times. And it also starts to point out, well, if colleges are finding these test scores so important to the point where an administrator actually lost his job because he was inflating a test score, then we should consider taking it seriously and understanding, well, what this means is, if I help to make the school look good and I am, bringing up my test scores, and then there's more opportunity for me to get money from the university because I'm making them look good in the marketplace. So the other thing that tends to come up that I always like to clarify is that a lot of schools are say that they are SAT optional or ACT optional now. And there is a distinction in whatever I'm talking about. I am not just talking about getting into a university. Our focus is understanding how we get money from universities. So when it comes to the SAT optional, they're talking about this in regards to admissions. So they're believing, SAT test scores, GPA aren't, GPA can be more of an academic indicator of how well you're going to do at a university. So they don't want to take a look at test scores. Totally understandable when it comes to getting admitted into a school. However, that is not the same case in regards to getting money from the school. One of the examples that I have is, actually, we had a family that works with a coworker of mine that had applied to Baylor in Texas and had really great test scores, but the parents were like, well, it's test optional, we're not going to submit her test scores. And she wound up getting, I think it was $6,000 a year, when she would have gotten $16,000 a year if she had submitted her scores. So when it comes to getting in, it doesn't have an impact, but it can in regards to getting money. So it's one of those things that if you tested well, you should always submit your scores, because that's going to come into conversation for them in divvying out their aid. Now, the rest of this picture in terms of what makes up our student obviously isn't just test scores. So we've also got GPA, and this is something where the colleges do like to see that our GPA is correlated with our test score. So let's just say you have a 4.0 GPA, but you have a 900 test score. So they're going to be like, so do you just take a whole bunch of cupcake classes? Are you really bad at test taking? Or maybe it's the other way around. You've got like a 3.0 GPA, but you've got a 1400 on your SAT. So they're going to be like, are you just maybe really talented at test taking and just perhaps kind of lazy? Like, what's the story there? When it comes to rigor of schedule, this is are we taking honors, AP, IB, whatever it is that's offered at our school. The colleges do want to see that we are challenging ourselves, but they also want to make sure that you know how to not, take on too much. So if you're, like, oh my gosh, I have to take 5 AP classes, and you know that that's going to be too much of a workload for you and your GPA tanks because of it, right? That wasn't a good balance. So I always say, if you're not a US history kid, then don't feel the pressure of taking AP US history. If you're more of a math science kid, then take the math science classes that you know you're going to enjoy and still do well in and maintain your GPA. So don't feel like you need to take every single hard class, especially at the loss of reducing your GPA. And extracurricular activities, this is something where you have an opportunity to show the college what it is that you're up to and what it is that you're interested in. So they like to know what it is that you're going to be up to when you get on their campus. So sometimes it's music, sometimes it's sports. I've seen the gamut of it all. And really the point is they just want you to have an identity. And I always have a silly thing, for boys, video games, however, don't count as an extracurricular activity. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Diversity, though, this is something where we can start to think outside of the box, because this is where a lot of people will just think like ethnic diversity, but this is something where we have geographic diversity now as a benefit, because there really aren't a lot of schools on the West Coast. A lot of stuff tends to lie to the mid to East Coast, and if we're willing to travel, that can open up a lot of doors. Student interest, this is where I start to think of college as a business. So it's like big tobacco, big pharma, it's big college. They want to know that we're interested in their university. And so you can be just an application. That's not really going to do us a lot of good. Or you can go on the other end of the extreme, and it can be like your one and only pick school. Okay, we don't want to do that either. We want to show that we're interested, and there's lots of ways that we can go about doing that. But here's an example for you. So let's just say we are going out to visit some schools, and we're going to go visit Walla Walla and go tour Whitman. And we're going because mom and dad went there, grandma and grandpa went there, aunt and uncle went there, and it's like your favorite school. So when you show up on the tour, you're wearing the Whitman sweatshirt and the Whitman hat, and you're like, rah, 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 like everybody knows that you are in love with Whitman, okay? Now let's just say we have another kid that goes on that tour, and they're equally smart, but they're like, you know what, I could see myself here. It's a cool school, but Linfield looks pretty nice, and there's a couple other schools on my list as well. Now, really, in this process, where does the rubber meet the road? Like, when it comes down to it, is it when we find out if we get into a school, or is it when we find out how much money we get in order to go? Okay, when we think about that, and that's why I say it should never be a question of us getting into a school. That should be a given. The question should always be, well, how much money am I going to get in order to go? So when we think about those two kids, who's likely to get more money? Who's going to need more convincing to get them to come? Okay, and if we think about it, they've got Mr. Rah-Rah, hook, line, and sinker, right? They could charge him more to go there, and they'd pay because they want to go there so badly, and it's his only school. Versus the other kid that has options and choices and is being more competitive, right? Then there's, you still want to show that you're interested, but you still want to have competition and more than just one school on the list. okay? Because when they've got you hook, line, and sinker, we don't have to give you as much to convince you to come as somebody else, okay? Essays, though, these are important, okay? And I always say, think about who should write them, right? The answer should be the student, okay? We always say it's good to have it looked over if you've got an English teacher or somebody that you can work with on essays to make sure that it's really polished and great, but we still want it to be in the student's tone and all of that. So just be careful. Now, when it comes down to it, I have this thing on here. The one thing that can be dramatically changed in this process, really a lot of times when we get to junior year, senior year especially, right? It's not like our GPA is going to go up dramatically. We're not going to be able to super change our schedule. It kind of is what it is and what we're doing for activities. So, a lot of what our picture is already in place in junior year. But the one thing that can always be dramatically changed to tell a story is going to be you walking into the SAT or ACT and rocking that test. Because I've had kids where it was like, ooh, freshman year just was not good. GPA was not good. But then they started to pick it up and you could see the positive progression of going towards, say, A's and B's. But their GPA is probably never going to recover from that by the time we get to junior year, okay? However, they can walk into an SAT and ACT and say, you know what, I'm not just my GPA, and really I studied for this test and I'm going to rock it. So sometimes we can see a higher test score can help offset a GPA, that sort of a thing. So that's part of, my soapbox is always make sure that you're really putting in that time and effort, because it really can have a huge impact. Now, this is kind of the highlight of what makes up our students. And like I said, we have to match that with the best fit schools for them. So what we're looking for in our universities, is it West Coast, East Coast? Is it near the water? What kind of majors do they have? All of that good stuff. But I always like to show you really how you guys go about picking your schools. And this is David Letterman style, okay? And I always like to pick on the students first. You've got boyfriend, girlfriend, all of my friends are going. I do not know how often I wind up having kids come into my office and saying, oh, well, all my friends are going to WSU and it's just going to be so great and that's why I want to go there. Okay, we know that's not going to work out, but that's the way they're thinking right now. Education is cool. This is California in a nutshell. I don't know if any of you have gone down and visited California. Pepperdine is a really shiny, pretty school. It's on Malibu, and of course the dorms open right up onto the beach. So, like, Dad, no, that has no reason for me to want to go to that school. Now, it's a party school. Don't tell my dad. Good sports teams, obviously that has merit, especially if we want to play a sport. My disclaimer is always, if you get hurt, you still have to like the school. So make sure that you're picking your school for all of the other reasons as well, academics and that sort of a thing, so that you would be happy there in the event that anything happens. Parents, though, you're super easy. Money, 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 okay? Quality of education, though, we do definitely want that. And I went there. We do tend to get some parental pride in the mix for sure. Any school within 2 hours drive of home. I hear that one quite a bit. And then window sticker, right? So that's just pure vanity of Princeton would look really good on the back of my BMW, that sort of a thing, okay? Now, in all reality, though, this is my corny canned answer. Okay, so this is something I would be tickled to hear from a student. I would love to attend XYZ University. It is a great opportunity for me to study biology or history, and in fact, this university is well known for its outstanding faculty, and it is credited for being one of the best universities at which to study biology or history. And by the way, they offer the best financial aid package in comparison to their short list of competitors. This is always like my aw moment, okay? And really there's two things to think about that's going on with this. One is they actually have an idea of what they want to study before they go to the school. Okay, I'm not saying that you need to know that you want to be a mechanical engineer, but I am saying that if you are wanting to be a teacher, you better make sure that they have that as a major at the university, or else why are we even going? Okay. And then the second piece is they say they have the best financial aid package in comparison to their short list of competitors. Okay, well, we know that all colleges are like in competition with each other, but what they mean here is it's the short list. So a lot of times there's the same kind of kids applying to the same kind of school. So then there's opportunity to have kind of natural competition within your list. So that's something to take into consideration. So we just got done talking about all of the stuff that makes up our students, and now we have to match that with what we're looking for in our schools. And this is more behind the scenes stuff that the colleges don't talk about. And the first one on here is enrollment yield. So enrollment yield is how many students are accepted versus how many actually attend and show up on the first day of class. So if we use Hiram as our case study, most people haven't heard of Hiram in Ohio, all right? And I always prompt people, does the fact that you've never heard of Hiram say anything about the quality of education of that school? And your answer should be no, all right? Hiram is actually a really great university. They have a really high placement of their kids into med school. They don't have a quality problem, all right? They have a marketing problem. And the trouble is there's 1,300 schools in the United States, and we're not going to know all of them by name, all right? And so if we think about it, if Hiram has to send out 8,000 acceptance letters to get 2,000 kids to show up on the first day of class, that makes their enrollment yield 25%. Now, how do they convince those 2,000 kids to come to Hiram? They offer them money, right? So what they do is they say, hey, Hiram, I cost $39,750, but for you, we're going to give you the gold medal scholarship award, and it's only $29,760. Congratulations and welcome to Hiram. Really, all they're doing is saying, this is our sticker price, and this is the discount that we're going to give you off of it, okay? And the big thing is you don't want to be the guy that's paying the sticker price, all right? Now, if we think about enrollment yield as well, and we apply that to, say, UW, does UW have an enrollment yield problem? No, right? People are banging down the door to get into that school. They don't have to discount us down to get us to come. So the likelihood of us getting money to go to UW is slim to none. All right. Now, the second thing, enrollment management, this is their calculus that they use to determine how much money it is that they need to give us. So traditionally, we have been taught that admissions tells us whether we get in, financial aid tells us whether we're going to get money in order to go. Well, enrollment management's job is to say, well, what is the best incoming freshman class that I want, and how much, which is admissions, right? And how much do I have to pay them to get them to come? That's financial aid. So what they're doing in the world of enrollment management is they're marrying admissions and financial aid together. Makes sense, right? So they have spent a lot of money and a lot of time. This has been happening since the 80s. They've just gotten better at it to determine at times down to the penny how much it's going to take to get you to come, right? Now, really the goal at the end of the day is that we do want the college to want our student badly enough to consider discounting down the price to get us to come. Now, going back to my rule of thumb, the goal is that we want to be in that top 25% of the incoming freshman class when it comes to our schools and our scores. Now, if we think about that, right, it goes back to that vicious cycle. The higher we bring up our test scores, the better we look to the school, the better we make them look, and then that in return means that we are likely to get more money also in order to come. So all around, it winds up being the strength of being in that top 25% really positions us really well for financial aid. Some rules of thumb in this approach, we like to use what we call a top-down approach. And this is really where we want to make sure you're doing a comprehensive college search. Like I said, there's 1,300 schools out there. So that's a lot of information to have to sift through, even if you've narrowed it down to even say 100. It can take a lot of time and effort to really go through and like seriously look at each of those schools. And so what we say is we want to get it down to 6 to 10, and we want to make sure that you're looking at schools yet again on that academic fit, social fit, and financial fit. So whenever we go about doing a college search, that's what we're incorporating into that conversation. And I know a lot of people can get overwhelmed with how much information is out there on College Board or on all of these different websites. And a lot of times it's really just the wisdom of understanding what we need to filter, what we need to look at, and what we don't, so that we can really hone our list in a way that makes sense for a family. And like I said, 6 to 10 schools is our intention. And when we say within your wheelhouse, that's going back to making sure that you're going to be happy at your school and you're not going to be struggling academically as well. So one of the things I always want to tell people is, I know that you've heard this philosophy of, well, you should have a good handful of reach schools on your list, maybe a target school or two, and then a safety school. And a lot of people wind up having lists that are a lot of reach schools. Now, I'm not here to kill dreams, okay? If you do have a reach school or two on the list, that's totally okay. My request is that you just don't have your entire list made up of those schools. Because if you think about it, you're then at the bottom of the incoming freshman class for those schools. Are you likely to get any money in order to go there? Okay, no. It's just not going to happen. A lot of times in those circumstances, you're going to be when you're at the bottom of the incoming freshman class, you better be willing to pay whatever their list price is in order to go there, because we don't tend to get a lot of discounts at that point in time. All right, so yet again, going back to, we want to be in that top 25%, because then we're strong academically. You're positioning yourself well to get out of that university in 4 years, and they're also, we're positioning ourselves to get discounts from them as well. And I talked about this earlier, being willing to travel from the West Coast can cut the cost. A lot of people don't wind up believing that that is true. However, I was actually just talking to a family this morning, and they're like, we keep getting contacted from all of these schools that were on the East Coast, and now I really do wish that we had opened up the scope and looked at those schools. And that happens a lot, actually. A lot of times when people wind up coming into my office, I have this huge map of all of the schools, and everybody always goes, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that there were so many schools in the Midwest to the East Coast. We really don't have a lot over here on the West Coast. So it's something definitely to take into consideration. I always say it's always worth trying and applying. At the end of the day, you have the option to choose, right, where you want to go. Retention and graduation rates, though, I talked a little bit about graduation rates, but retention as well as, well, how many kids are coming back sophomore year? So if only 20% of kids are returning, then why did we go there in the first place? Okay. Now, this is where I like to take a turn and start talking about the financial stuff. So this is a comic that's been running around. We've got mom and dad over here saying, move back home. Kids today are so lazy and irresponsible. Your mother and I started out with nothing. And then we got the kid over here going, trust me, I would have loved starting out with nothing. We know the moral to the story. We don't want them getting debted up with so much student loans that they're just coming home and living in the basement or what have you. In my world, student loans are really created for one reason and one reason only: accountability. So you can get student loans for the 4 years that you're going to be in school, and then I'll say, hey, this is how much we've budgeted and saved to be able to help pay for your successful 4-year graduation. So that if it takes them a 5th or a 6th year, that they're then owning that responsibility and being accountable for that. There's always exceptions to the rule, but at the end of the day, we want to get done in 4 years, because we're generally only awarded money on a 4-year basis. So when we stay at a school for a fifth or a sixth year, that cost gets dramatically higher. So we want to make sure that we're doing it in a timely fashion. Now, this is just a look at some of the college costs right now. University of Washington is at 27. Washington State is reducing down gradually the cost of the state schools, so we expect to see those come down a little bit. And then on the high end, we've got Whitman at $54,000 a year, and the low end right now is Eastern at about 21. The biggest thing, though, is that 25% of the public college students graduate in 4 years. All right, the national average is at 6.24 years for a 4-year degree. There is a reason why we talk about graduation rates. It is not it's not given anymore that you can get out of a university in 4 years. And so sometimes we have to take into consideration, if we're looking at some of those big state schools, whether we could even get into our major. UW is a great example of that. Their engineering computer science program has a really high barrier of entry in terms of GPA, and not a lot of kids get in as a freshman. And so you have to stay there for 2 years at the school and then apply for your major and hope that you get in. If you don't get in, then you're picking a different major, you're transferring to a different school, right? That's just going to add on more time that you're going to be there. And if we're transferring, definitely adding on more cost. So it's always something to take a look at in regards to what graduation rates are for the universities. Financial positioning. The good news is there is money out there for everyone, but there is some primary ways that aid winds up being lost every year. One is that forms are filled out incorrectly. So a lot of times people won't know that, say, their IRA, they'll think that that's an investment, and so they'll list that down as an investment on the financial aid forms. And you don't know that you don't need to do that unless you read all of the tiny fine print. Okay, so you just overly reported your information. Also, parents don't understand that there are rules in this process and strategy. I liken this to taxes. Okay, so accountants, their job is to take a look at how, what the rules are their IRS has put in place, and what have a strategy on how they can reduce down your tax bill. College planners have rules that they have to follow through FAFSA in the financial aid world, and strategy to reduce down how much you're expected to contribute towards college. So that's really important in understanding then how the rules and strategy work in this process. And families do like to look in the wrong places for money, and we're going to talk about that. We don't want the small money, we want the big money. So where we look for the money that we can get. And then procrastinating until senior year. You can't do that anymore. We now actually have to fill out financial aid forms even earlier, which we're going to talk about. And so we really need to focus on getting this process started as early as sophomore year. I've had kids that even come on as freshmen to really get involved in the conversation. But sophomore year is ideal so that we can start thinking about things and planning financially as well to get things done. Now, what is financial aid even based on? Well, there's two kind of big categories. There's need and there's merit. So need is how much money do I make, what's my income, my assets, how many kids do I have in college, that sort of a thing. And then there's merit. So that's the stuff that makes up my kid, grades, GPA, extracurriculars, all of that. And then I have this big other category under merit. And I'm going to tell you that that's money. So what I mean by that is, if we have two kids that are exactly the same academically, but one has $100,000 and the other one has $0, who's likely to get more money in order to go? Okay, you know the answer to that. This isn't rocket science. So when it comes to, if we have $100,000, right, the college is more than happy to take our money before they have to give us any of their own. So, the one that has $0 is positioned better financially in terms of maximizing getting discounts in order to go. And we're going to talk more about that and the enrollment management concept and how all of that plays into this. Now, how much aid is out there and where can we get it? Well, there's $185 billion out there, but the biggest chunk of that you're going to see is 38% in federal loans. We don't want loans, we want the free money. So the next biggest chunk is 19% in federal Pell Grants. Now, most of us aren't going to qualify for that. That tends to be bottom of the barrel need-based aid. However, the next biggest chunk is 18% in institutional grants. So if you think about it, institutional grants, that's money that's coming from the universities and going directly to you, all right? The irony is that this is the biggest bucket of money that winds up being missed by people, okay? Going back to my rule of thumb, in order to maximize getting that money, you need to be in the top 25% of the incoming freshman class when it comes to your school and your scores in order to position to get that money, okay? And if we look at this chart, what is the one thing that is so small and so insignificant it didn't even make it on here, but everybody always talks about it? Okay, I call this the big dirty S word because it's scholarships. And this is where I like to define, well, what is a scholarship? Whenever I say scholarship, I'm talking about a private scholarship. So the $500 Rotary Scholarship, the $1,000 BECU Scholarship, I went to my counseling office and they have all these little applications that I can fill out for these scholarships, okay? So I'm not saying don't go do that. I'm just saying know when it's beneficial and know when it's not as beneficial. So if you say, Crystal, I am applying to just state schools, then I'm going to say you need to go get those scholarships and go see your counseling office to get that too, because that's going to be a big opportunity for you to get some discounts because the universities may not have as much money to be able to give being state schools, okay? But if you say, well, I'm looking at a variety of schools, some are state, a lot are private, then this is where you're better off positioning yourselves and getting the money from the institutional grant bucket, okay? Rather than getting $1,000 scholarship, this is where we can get $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 from these universities per year, okay? I like extra zeros. So when it comes to it, some of those schools will take into consideration as well that you got an outside scholarship and they can sometimes reduce down your aid accordingly. So we're going to take a look at kind of how they assess how much aid we can get and an example of that. So the formula that they use is COA, which is cost of attendance of a university. So that's that sticker price that we were looking at earlier, minus our EFC, so that's expected family contribution, and that's when you fill out forms how much the government says that you can afford to pay for school. So if you subtract one from the other, you're going to get a need. If you go get a resource like a scholarship, then they're going to modify your need. So this example shows the cost of a school is $38,000. This family's EFC was $24,000, so the difference between the two was their need of $14,000. And then they went and got a $2,000 Rotary Scholarship. So what the school then did was they modified their need down to $12,000. And that's when a lot of people are like, okay, well, that means, you know, if I go get that $2,000 scholarship, then I have $2,000, you know, less that I have to pay for school. And that's not always the case. So when the university modifies your need, they say, well, you needed 12 or 14,000, but then you went and got that scholarship for $2,000. So now I, as a university, actually only need to give you 12. So that's one of those things that, you know when the scholarships like that are going to be beneficial and when they're not going to be as beneficial. All right, now how and when to apply for aid. There are some forms in this process. The first one is the FAFSA. That's the Federal Application for Student Aid. This is what has changed is now we are no longer looking at January 1st of senior year. We are looking at October of senior year and filling out this financial aid form. So what they're doing is looking at prior year for taxes. And what that means is if you're a 2018 grad, then they're going to be looking at your 2016 tax return. So that's why I said starting to plan in this process earlier is beneficial, especially when it comes to the financial piece, because now they're looking an extra year back. A lot of times, what this is also meant for families is they have changes that happen, like maybe that year doesn't accurately reflect how much their income was and what happened. So that means then appealing to the university and letting them know the circumstances, if there was changes in a job and that sort of a thing, to make sure that they are getting the full picture for financial aid purposes. Now, we also have the financial aid profile and then institutional forms. A lot of times this winds up being the private universities. They like to ask more for more financial information. A lot of my clients like to call that the colonoscopy. Okay, they ask, it's like a 20-page form, and it goes into a lot of detail. So we also want to make sure everything is consistent from form to form in terms of the information that we're submitting. As well, there's college-specific scholarship forms sometimes to fill out outside of the financial aid and applications. And then if we're divorced or we have businesses, or they ask to verify our financial information, there's a lot of different things that can come up in this process. My rule of thumb with this is you always need to apply for aid. I have families that'll be like, well, I make high six figures in terms of income, I'm not going to qualify. And it's kind of like that conversation I shared about the SAT scores with Baylor. I've had families where they said, yeah, I'm not going to qualify. Well, I had kids going to WSU, and mom was like, well, I didn't fill out the forms, but then they wouldn't even let my kids register for classes. So the college has the right to be able to withhold registering for classes, to withhold their own financial aid if they don't get to see your financial picture. So it's always beneficial to fill out financial aid forms and position yourself, because you could lose out on an opportunity for aid by not submitting, just like and choosing not to submit SAT or ACT scores. This example, it says private versus public. It really could be private, public, public. It doesn't matter. The point here is starting to understand the different qualities of aid that universities provide. So here on one side, you can see the cost of a school is $30,000. The EFC, or that expected family contribution, was 10. So then we had a need at that school of 20. This school gave us 100% of what we needed, and 80% of that was free money, and then the other 20% was the form of a loan. So the total cost of that school then wound up being our EFC plus our loan wound up being $14,000 a year for the original $30,000 a year school, versus a school that originally cost 18. Our EFC is still 10, so then we only need 8,000 in order to go there, but they only gave us 50% of what we needed. That's what we call gapping. They shorted us what we needed in order to go to the school. And then what they did give us was only $2,000 in free money, and then $2,000 in the form of a loan. So when you add all of that back up, the $18,000 a year school still wound up costing costing $16,000. So this goes back to also why I say you can't focus on sticker price. You have to understand what kind of schools give what kind of money, and then what kind of aid are you going to be able to qualify for, so that we know so we have an idea of how much we can get the costs down to. So focusing on a sticker price and letting that scare you doesn't do us any good, because a lot of times those prices aren't as high as they actually appear to be. Now, I always talk more about the FAFSA as well, because it is a really powerful form in understanding. Obviously, you need to fill it out correctly, but this is starting to understand that strategy piece on these financial aid forms. So we've got two families, Family A and Family B. Family A, you can see actually both of the families, all of their income, assets, and all of that's the same. The only thing that's different is their EFC. So Family A is what I call the procrastinator. So they waited till the last minute, filled out financial aid forms, and they wound up with an EFC of a little over $19,000 a year. Family B, however, was like, okay, so I understand there's this enrollment management stuff. I need to position myself academically and financially at my schools. Let's play this game and really position ourselves. And they repositioned financially, and they were able to reduce down their EFC from the 19,000 to a little over 8,200 a year. All right. If we look at that, that's a $10,000 difference. All right. And not just over 1 year, but over 4 years, that's $40,000. So we could have just spent $40,000 more for school than we needed to. So this is part of why we say we need to know what our EFC is now, and we need to know whether we have an opportunity to reduce it. So one of the things that I like to look at is running an analysis and being able to look at a family's picture to say, okay, well, where are we at academically? What kind of schools are we looking at? And what is that financial picture, so that you can start to understand what kind of schools can we get money to go to? How can we position ourselves in order to maximize aid and make this happen? So one of my biggest things as well is people will always freak out about what their EFC number is, because everybody always thinks it's too high, and it is. But the thing is, it's kind of like focusing on sticker price. You can't focus on what that number is. You have to understand what it means individually to each kind of school and the opportunity for you to get aid from them. So that's always my intention when working with a family. Now, understanding this financial positioning and more yet again on the strategy piece, there's different kinds of assets that the colleges are looking at. There's what we call accessible and non-accessible assets. An accessible asset is based on the college's rules, has to be reported. It's part of the conversation and mix. A non-accessible asset doesn't have to be reported, or it's not going to be taken into consideration for your ability to pay. All right. So one of those things is looking at, well, do we have anything that's accessible that we can make non-accessible? And sometimes the answer is no. So not everybody has that opportunity. Now, as well, different assets being owned by different people has an impact. So sometimes there's grandparent owned 529 plans, sometimes parents have assets, sometimes students have assets. So really the formula takes different things into consideration. And so having money in a student's name is the worst possible place it can be. So we definitely want to have conversation about that. And then grandparents, a lot of times having money set aside, it's always really great. You know, they've helped save, but sometimes that can also have an impact on aid in future years when we use those funds. So we have to take into consideration where the money is coming from. As well, if we have different assets, some of us have businesses and homes and vacation properties. There are so many different ways that you can value these things. And we obviously want to give an accurate value, but we also don't want to overly report. All right. So just because Zillow says your house is worth $600,000 doesn't mean that that should be the value that we're reporting. Also, understanding the tax and financial aid ramifications of all of this stuff combined. So like I said, we're looking 2 years back now, and we want to make sure, especially if we have more than one kid going through this process, we want to make sure that there's a sound plan for all of the kids on how we're going to pay for college and what that's going to look like, so that we don't have a ramification of losing out on aid because something wasn't done right. This is a timeline in regards to what's up for junior, senior year. So junior year, this is where we talk about career and aptitude testing. So what are you interested in? And PSAT, I have this up here. This happens in October of junior year. And the reason is the National Merit Qualification Test. So this is the first opportunity. If you do score really well on the test, it's a reason to study for the PSAT. You have an opportunity to get some large merit awards from universities. And then I talked about this. The intention is taking the SAT or ACT in junior year. A lot of times we say, let's see if we can take it at the beginning of junior year in the fall or the winter, and then again in the early spring, so that we're avoiding having to take this test around the same time we have finals. And then start looking at our colleges. check the status of our high school path. So that's the AP, the IB, what kind of classes can we take? And then find people for our letters of recommendation. This is traditionally junior year teachers, so think about who you like for junior year and be in communication with them on what they want from you for those. Start working on a resume, do any scholarship searches that you're going to do, and then really when it comes down to it, go visit colleges. All right, this is something that, especially if we're having a hard time understanding what it is that we like about a school, it can start to put it into perspective. Or if we're not really feeling motivated and don't really know what's going on, right? Getting engaged in this process and going and seeing different kinds of schools can really start to make this real for kids and get them jump started on this process. Senior year, finish strong academically. This is huge now. Colleges do ask for final transcripts to make sure that you didn't slack off in senior year. So you still want to make sure that you're doing well. And then SAT, ACT, we can take that again in senior year if we have to. Continue refining our college search, do more visits, and then applications. This is my other rule of thumb. If you smell turkey and you have not filled out your applications yet, that's what those 4 days are for. And then now we've got October is the FAFSA. So October 1st is when it opens. The intention is in the first few weeks of October to get the financial aid forms filled out. November tends to be final deadline for financial aid profile, and then December a lot of schools for institutional forms. We may see some of those changes happening now that we've got the FAFSA being earlier. March and April is when we start to get our award letters, and then final acceptance day is May 1st. So that's when we pick our school, and then we start filling out housing applications, and you're on your merry way. Now, a couple of case studies for you. Here we've got Alyssa. She's the oldest of two kids. She had an SAT score of 14 out of the 1600, but her parents didn't even think that private school was an option because they thought that they couldn't afford it. They had an income of about $72,000 a year. They did have some money saved up in some different accounts. The first run through on their EFC was $26,000 a year according to the profile, and then $16,000 a year according to the FAFSA, which they couldn't afford. Now, what they did was they repositioned themselves financially. They were able to reduce their EFC on the profile from 26 down to 20, and then on the FAFSA from 16 down to 10. She was also looking at schools that were all a really good fit for her in her wheelhouse. So that was Whitman, WSU, Lewis and Clark, Gonzaga, PLU, and Richmond. Lewis and Clark and Whitman at the time were about $45,000 a year, and Whitman gave her $31,000 a year, and Lewis and Clark gave her $26,000. So she chose to go to Whitman. She was paying about $14,000 a year, which is about the same cost for tuition and fees at UW right now. Reducing down their EFC, it was $95,000, and the school still only cost about $52,000. Okay. So the second thing though is, well, how did we reduce our EFC from 116 down to 95? Okay, and it's not so much that it reduced it, right? I mean, it's still $95,000 a year. But what it did is we took those assets that were accessible at $300,000 and we made it non-accessible. So we repositioned financially in order to take that money off the radar screen of the university. Okay, so that's part of understanding. The EFC will always be high based on their family income because their family income is high. But when it comes to assets, they leveled the playing field. So I always, if we use the example, if we have Rachel and we have the clone of Rachel, right? So they're both equal, but that clone of Rachel still has $300,000 sitting there. Who's gonna, if they both have equally high income, who's going to get more money in order to go? The one who has $300,000 sitting there on the radar, or the one who has $0? Okay, that's where we start to think about that enrollment management conversation in action, as the colleges want to know, well, do you have an ability to pay me before I need to give you any of my own money? So that's part of, they have an ability to, it's their money. They get to choose how they're going to spend it. So the question is, are we going to position ourselves so that they spend it on us? Okay. And this is why there has become a lot of a gray area between this. Do I, is it need? Is it merit? Sometimes it's just incentive money. So that's part of understanding the game that the colleges are playing, and how we position. Now, to wrap this up, there's really the questions that we want you to be thinking about is, well, what is my EFC? That expected family contribution, what is that number? And do I have an opportunity to reduce that down? And if so, how? And then, of course, what schools are also going to be a good fit for my student, have the majors they want, and position them to get out in 4 years. Okay. And one of the things that I offer is to sit down and have conversation with you about where, like I said, where your student is academically, and do what we call a FAFSA review, so we can see where the trouble spots are and have conversation about what kind of schools we can get money in order to go to. So the free 1 hour FAFSA review is really, like I said, to discuss our student and our finances. And I send you over some information so you can be best prepared for that meeting, as well as directions to my office. Ideally, we would love to have a husband, wife, and student to make the most out of that meeting, just because obviously the student's going to be the one that's going to school, and we love to have the support of the whole family and everybody on the same page. So I really hope that you got something out of the class, and feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email to schedule a time to get together, and I look forward to hearing from you soon.